Welcome aboard. Welcome to today's tour. We are back in Sullivan County, New York, for the second part of a two-part tour about Woodstock, the music and art festival held in Bethel, New York in 1969. If you have not watched part one yet, you can find a link to it in the description below. Part one was Finding Woodstock, and we talked about how the Woodstock Festival came together and who was behind this event. Today, we'll be talking more about the three-day event itself, although it did go into the fourth day. Let's take a look at our flight plan today. First, we will be heading north of the airport to Liberty, New York. Liberty is where many of the musicians and bands were put up for the weekend. From there, we will head south to Bethel and then on to Max Yasgar's dairy farm where the festival took place. As I mentioned, we are back at the Sullivan County International Airport in Monticello, New York. And today we are flying the Bell 47G2 helicopter. The B-47G2 is a single-engine, multi-purpose light helicopter manufactured by the Bell Helicopter Corporation. I wanted to get a closer look at the site, so I figured a helicopter was the way to go. I'm still learning how to fly the helicopter, so I don't have too many hours logged yet, but we should make it to our destination, even though it may not be the smoothest ride. I will get the helicopter started and we will be ready to talk about Woodstock, the music festival held from August 15th through 18th, 1969 on Max Yasgar's dairy farm in Bethel, New York. Well, we have managed to get into the air, and if this is your first time with us, welcome. What I do is I find interesting stories and places, and we find them here in Microsoft Flight Simulator. Let's head north towards Liberty. As we discussed in our previous tour, the four main individuals behind the Woodstock Festival were Michael Lang, the event promoter; Artie Kornfeld, he was a musician and record label executive; Joel Rosenman, he was an investor and one of the financial backers for the event; John Roberts, another investor and also a financial backer for the event. Woodstock was not the first festival of its kind. The Monterey Pop Festival and the Magic Mountain Music Festival took place in 1967. About 40,000 people attended Magic Mountain, and estimates for the Monterey Festival would be between 25,000 and 90,000 people. Woodstock would go on to eclipse both of these attendance numbers. And this team behind the Woodstock Festival would quickly go from putting on a music festival to, in their own words, getting into city management that weekend in 1969. As we talked about in the last tour, the site was not completed by the weekend of the event. This was due to the change in venue. And an indication of what was to come was revealed when the sun came up on Thursday morning and 6,000 to 7,000 people were already sitting in the field, a day and a half before the scheduled start of the event. And by Friday morning, that number would swell to close to 60,000 people. With the masses from across the country now descending on the small towns in the Catskill Mountains of New York, the event team would soon be in crisis management mode. The start of the festival on Friday was dealt a few problems early on. These were traffic, and more traffic. About 500 acres had been arranged for parking, but two problems arose with that. One, it had rained, making most of the fields unusable since they were complete mud. And second, the state police, who were supposed to control the traffic flow into the area and ensure the cars were moved off of the roadway, deployed hours later than they had planned to. And now, with gridlock for miles in every direction, John Roberts said that even with these issues, things would have worked out. if it was 100,000 people with about 30,000 or 40,000 cars as expected, but 4 times that showed up in Bethel, New York that Friday. That's right, 400 to 500,000 people would be at or around that site, and some estimate another million were on the roads trying to get to New York. The state police would eventually close the exits off the New York State Thruway, while the surrounding towns dealt with traffic and the onslaught of young people flooding into these small towns. The festival team had to solve the next big issue: tickets. Midday on Friday, there was up to 60,000 people already on the field. How the hell were they going to collect tickets and force those without tickets to buy them? Mel Lawrence, the director of operations, said, "We talked about moving everyone off the field and then having them pass back through the ticket gates." Michael Lang pointed out that there were no ticket gates or booths to pass through. Remember that the fencing had not been completed and the ticket booths and gates were not in place by Friday, the day of the festival. One of the promoters' main goals for the event was that, unlike other festivals, those in charge of security would be there to help, not to enforce. Wes Pomeroy, head of security, had plans to not let any issue about admission escalate into a confrontation. He had planned on a few approaches to do this, one being a school bus parked along the fence with a hole under it, to allow those who were going to sneak in anyways a safe spot to evade security without issue. He was also going to have a few thousand tickets in his pocket to de-escalate any confrontation over tickets that could not be solved. The group's discussion about tickets in the crowd became a moot point. John Morris, the head of production, realized that there were injuries now occurring with the large crowds trying to climb the metal fencing that was in place, and he didn't want the crowd to get pushed against the fencing, so he argued to the group that they had to take down the fencing before someone got seriously hurt. His statement to the group was, "You're now putting on the world's biggest freebie." John, Joel, Artie, and Michael made the call, and John Morris made his way to the stage to make the somewhat famous announcement that Woodstock was now a free concert. In an interview years later, one of the investors, Joel Rosenman, would say he found the term free amusing. He said, "We spent millions to make this a first-rate event, and it was far from free for us." The next issue? Well, remember all that traffic? That meant the musicians and bands could not get to the event site. The festival's start time came and went with no musical acts to put on stage. Many of them were at the Holiday Inn in Liberty, New York, which is our first stop today. This road below us is Route 17 and it heads north to Liberty, New York. Herbie Lipson owned the Holiday Inn, and it was the newest. It was built in 1967 and the nicest hotel that was close to the festival site. Most of the musicians stayed at this Holiday Inn. Herbie later said, "It was the best bar business I ever had in my life. Those people drank like fish. I said, screw New York state laws. I'm keeping the bar open day and night." He said, "This guy with hair down to his waist says to us, 'We want to run a tab.' I looked at him and said, 'Okay, who are you?' He said, 'We're Jefferson Airplane.' Herbie said, 'I didn't know Jefferson Airplane from TWA. So I asked for a bank reference. He said to call Bank of America in California. So I called, and I asked them, 'Are these guys good for the tab?' The guy at the Bank of America laughed and said, 'Whatever their bill is, add 3 zeros. They won't know the difference.'" All the coordination had been done to get rooms for everyone at the hotels, and the musicians and bands had been told where to arrive at these hotels. But now, the event team had no way to get them to the site because of all the traffic. John Morris turned to his wife at the time, Annie, and said, "Look up helicopters in the yellow pages and hire everyone you can get your hands on." The bands would have to be flown into the festival site, and a hasty helicopter landing area was set up in the backstage area. They would end up using around 24 helicopters, including one supplied by the Army from West Point, flown by Warrant Officer Clark Stahl to shuttle people and supplies in and out of the area. Below us is the former Grossinger's Resort. It's now closed, but in 1969 it had a small airport. The airport was off to our right here somewhere, and at least some of the airplanes and helicopters used it to get people and supplies in and out of the area. Helicopters would help with this issue, but it had caused an unexpected delay. There were still no musical acts on site. The festival had 32 acts booked and was supposed to start at 3 p.m., but 2-hour delay and still no musical acts to put on the stage. Richie Havens was still wandering around the hotel after 3 p.m. and had not heard anything from the event team. He said, "I knew something was wrong, especially after seeing the news reports from the site." He said, "All of a sudden I hear this loud noise, and a helicopter comes overhead. It lands, and I am told to get in. I get in with some conga drums packed between me and another guy, and off we go." Richie arrived at the site, and although he was scheduled to play fourth, he was finally cornered by Michael Lang and convinced to be the first one to perform at Woodstock, and Richie took the stage a little after 5 p.m. And that is how Michael would run the stage for the next 3 days, shifting and putting on acts as they were available. Because Ritchie was the only musician on site, he was sent back out 5 or 6 times to play longer while they scrambled to get the rest of the musicians to the site. By the end, he had played every song he knew, and the famous performance of his Freedom he just made up on the spot. The rest of Friday would see the following artists perform: Sweetwater at 6:15, Bert Sommer at 7:15, Tim Hardin at 8:30, Ravi Shankar at midnight, and he would also be the first to play in the rain. At about midnight it started raining. In the midst of his set, he continued in spite of the rain, but eventually had to stop after 5 songs. Rain would continue to fall off and on throughout the event, creating a sea of mud and interrupting or delaying several performances. Throughout the night, the flow of people into Yasgar's farm continued non-stop. Melanie would perform at 1 a.m., Arlo Guthrie at 1:45 a.m., and Joan Baez formed at 3 a.m. The massive crowd stressed the logistics that had been planned for 100,000 people. It meant that the event team were now city managers in training. Woodstock would become the 3rd biggest city in New York for that weekend. Food at the concession stands had already been severely depleted by the 50,000 early arrivals throughout the week, and it quickly ran out. Concert goers had to make do with what they brought with them or that they could find at Bethel's overtaxed grocery stores. There were 600 Porto San porta potties and upwards of 500,000 people. You can do the math on that one. The Hog Farm, a hippie commune originally from California that had been recently staying in Manhattan's East Side, was originally asked to help with the setup of trails and fire pits around the site. They would go to take on feeding the crowd. They had planned to run some small free kitchens, but now that task had become much larger. This was the hippie commune founded by the animated character known as Wavy Gravy, whose real name was Hugh Romney. The festival organizers gave Lisa Law of the Hog Farm $3,000 and sent her shopping in New York City with the mission to feed 400,000. She returned from New York with food stocks and supplies, including meat cleavers, peelers, and garbage cans to serve it from. She would end up asking for and receiving another $3,000 to complete her shopping. She said they went through 160,000 plastic plates, forks, and knives, and another 30,000 large paper cups that they used for serving. The Hog Farm folks started cooking at great speed, and Wavy Gravy announced from the stage that there would be breakfast in bed for 400,000. They estimate they fed between 160 and 190,000 people at their free kitchen. Also, to help with this task, in Bethel, volunteers began making thousands of sandwiches that were sent in by helicopter to the site to feed the hungry masses. The town justice had to hold court in his living room to deal with the nearly 200 drug-related cases. The day's festival performances, originally scheduled to start in the evening, began shortly after noontime so that the crowd didn't get too restless and become unruly, and some of the artists were asked to lengthen their sets. On Saturday, the performances were kicked off by Quill at 12:15, Country Joe McDonald performed at 1:20 p.m., and Santana performed at 2 p.m. After Santana, there were no acts at the venue that they could put on to perform. This was due in part to the rain, which had prevented the production team from wanting to put on an electric act and needed an acoustic act that could play. The musician, John Sebastian, was at the festival. He was not supposed to perform, he just wanted to attend it. He didn't even have a guitar with him, but he was convinced to perform and keep the music ongoing for this enormous crowd. John Sebastian borrowed a guitar from his friend and fellow musician Tim Hardin and took the stage at 3:30 p.m. He said, "With a borrowed guitar and a buzz, I went on the stage at Woodstock." Following acts that day were the Keith Hartley Band at 4:45, the Incredible String Band at 6 p.m., Canned Heat at 7:30 p.m., Mountain at 9 p.m., The Grateful Dead at 10:30 p.m., Creedence Clearwater Revival at 12:30 a.m., Janis Joplin at 2 a.m., and Sly and the Family Stone at 3:30 a.m. As the word got out about the festival becoming a free event and no guarantee the investors and promoters would earn enough to cover their expenses, band managers became concerned about the bands receiving payment. The manager for The Who, for instance, refused to allow them to take the stage until they received payment in cash up front. A late-night call was made to Joel and John's banker in Sullivan County. He was picked up in the middle of the night in his pajamas and flown to his bank. He was able to round up some cashier checks that had luckily been missed and not put in the time-lock safe. Cashier checks were rushed back to the site and given to any manager that had held up the performance of their musicians. The Who's manager confirmed that he had received payment, and The Who took the stage at 5 a.m. Jefferson Airplane would perform at 8 a.m. Now that acts had gone well into Sunday morning, the acts that were scheduled to perform on Sunday during the day were Joe Cocker at 2 p.m., Country Joe and the Fish at 6:30 p.m., 10 Years After at 8:15 p.m., The Band at 10 p.m., Johnny Winter at 12 a.m., Blood, Sweat and Tears at 1:30 a.m., Crosby, Stills, Nash & Young at 3 a.m. Neil Young was not originally scheduled to play with them, but he did. He ended up getting into an argument with the cameraman that he didn't want on the stage. He would later be completely edited out of the Woodstock film that was being recorded during the event. Crosby, Still, Nash & Young were all experienced musicians, but at the time, the band was playing only their second gig together. The Paul Butterfield Blues Band went on at 6 a.m. Sha-Na-Na went on at 7:30 a.m. and at 9 a.m. on Monday morning, the final act and the headliner for the event, Jimi Hendrix. Jimmy almost didn't make it to the show. His chartered airplane flew into the wrong airport. He called Mel Lawrence and asked him if there was a way they could pick him up, but that wasn't possible. So Jimmy was left to find his own way from the airport to the Woodstock site. Mel said that he was on the phone with Jimmy and asked him if he could find any way from the airport. Jimmy put down the phone, came back a little bit later and said, "Yeah, I've got somebody that can drive me there." Mel said that Jimmy had paid someone at the airport passing by in a Ford Falcon station wagon to drive him to the site. It turned out that Neil Young was also on that same chartered flight that Jimmy was on and was also at the wrong airport. In an alternate story to this, it was told by Neil Young in a 1979 interview. Neil says that he, Jimmy, and Melvin Belly, an attorney, were all on the same flight and needed a way to the Woodstock site. Neil says that Melvin proceeded to steal a pickup truck from the airport, and the three drove to the festival in a stolen pickup. One of the most iconic performances at Woodstock was Jimi Hendrix's rendition of the Star-Spangled Banner at sunrise on Monday morning as the throngs of festival-goers streamed out of the site and back through the small towns in every direction. By Monday, August 18, 1969, John, Joel, Michael, and Artie had put on one of the biggest music festivals of all time that would become a cultural touchstone for the 1960s. Woodstock has been referenced in so many different ways in pop culture, and the phrase the Woodstock generation is the descriptor for the youth of the late 60s. Following the event, approximately 80 lawsuits were filed against Woodstock Ventures, primarily by farmers and business owners in the area. The cleanup went on for weeks, and these lawsuits and damage claims went on for even longer. John Roberts and Joel Rosenman had incurred over $1.4 million in debt from the festival. John was one of the heirs to the Block Drug Company fortune, and he and his family committed to honoring all the debts resulting from the festival. John and Joel, the investors, only had a small interest in the movie that was filmed at Woodstock, but they claim that small interest allowed them to eventually break even from this debt sometime around 1980. There were 2 confirmed deaths among the Woodstock's 500,000 attendees. Some reports have it at 3, but confirmed was 1 death that was from a suspected drug overdose. Richard Byler, an 18-year-old Marine, died at Woodstock, and the other was Raymond Mizak, a 17-year-old that was sleeping and protecting himself from the rain inside his sleeping bag when a water tank trailer hauling away sewerage mistakenly drove over him. Not everyone has fond memories of Woodstock. Pete Townsend and Roger Daltrey of The Who have been longtime critics in the aftermath. Of course, they both had been involuntarily dosed with LSD that was in the coffee and tea backstage. Pete Townsend would have to hit political activist Abby Hoffman in the head with his guitar and throw him off the stage when he attempted to take his microphone. Other musicians who went on to describe their experience at Woodstock as less than pleasant were Grace Slick, who described Woodstock as a bunch of stupid slobs in the mud. The Grateful Dead also were not happy with the experience at the time. They had endured electrical shocks on stage due to the water and wet equipment. Of course, Neil Young, John Fogerty of Creedence Clearwater Revival, and others. From an attendee perspective, I'm sure that varies widely as well, but one attendee said, "I went to Woodstock with $300 worth of brand new camping equipment. I came back with none of it and wearing somebody else's shoes." Max Yasgur refused to rent out the farm again the following year in 1970 for another version of the festival, saying, "I'm going back to running a dairy farm." The New York State Legislature and the town of Bethel enacted mass gathering laws designed to prevent any more festivals from occurring. For years after the event, there were intentionally no signs or markers or any other indication to find the original site, even though thousands of people did find it every year. In 1984, the new landowners put up a monument and marker at the site. We are going to set down here roughly where the backstage area was and where they had to set up a helicopter landing area. Backstage was on this side of the road, and there was a wooden bridge or walkway up and over the road here to lead to the stage. In 1996, the site of the concert in the 1,400 acres surrounding it was purchased by cable television pioneer Alan Jerry for the purpose of creating the Bethel Woods Center for the Arts. And that is the building at the top of the hill here. The center opened on July 1st, 2006, with the performance by the New York Philharmonic. On August 13, 2006, Crosby, Stills, Nash & Young performed before 16,000 fans here at the new center, and it was 37 years after their performance at the original Woodstock. Located here, there's also a museum now. It's called the Museum at Bethel Woods. It opened on June 2nd, 2008. The museum contains film and interactive displays and artifacts that explore the unique experience of the Woodstock Festival. In August of 2013, the ashes of Richie Havens were scattered here across the site. That was a little bit about the 4-day event, the Woodstock Art and Music Festival. Hope you enjoyed the tour around Sullivan County, New York. The cost of today's tour is reasonable. Just reach down and hit that subscribe button. It helps the channel and I really appreciate it. I will be looking for a place to land, but that will be it for today and I will see you on the next tour.